some folks pretend that the facts around a discussion are neutral.
Exactly right.
And that's not true. Whether overtly or covertly, present, facts fill for you, lead the listener or the researcher or the masses a certain direction in the facts that are presented.
And they're chosen for a particular reason. So we might choose these facts because they support our point of view. We might look for historical justification for our point of view. Even if we're completely right about what actually happened in the past when we recall a certain history, that doesn't mean the facts are neutral, because we've chosen those facts
Our
and not
version.
others.
Yeah.
Not merely to frame. So a different question is whether we framed the facts in a particular way.
But just the facts, like this number of people dead or this number of people, this happened.
That's a great example. When you break something down into numbers, you've made a decision. You've made a decision to dehumanize at some level, because you've turned people into numbers. I'm not saying that's always a bad thing.
Right.
It's often the only way one can compare two different outcomes, to say more people died here than there, so there was more of a problem here than there. It's not that that's wrong. My claim is not that that's anything other than a fact. The claim is that the choice to compare these two events in terms of numbers of deaths is not a neutral decision. It's a decision that will justify a certain valuation of the events. There might be other ways of looking at the events. You could look at trying to evaluate how much suffering individuals had. You could look at responsibility for the events, whether they could be avoided. These are all different aspects of any, let's say, tragedy. We don't have to limit ourselves here to tragedies. We could look at good things too.
We could have good things. Yeah.
We could look at a school and how much benefit it brings.
Yeah.
Well, No Child Left Behind, a program brought in by a certain Texan president, George W. Bush, famously reduced a lot of school policy to metrics. How do we measure how well people are doing in different schools? And the net effect for many educators was that they ended up, as they say, teaching to the test. Many educators felt that a lot was lost there. A separate aspect of that, since racism is on the menu today, it appears, though that wasn't my intention. A separate side of it is that the worry that many voters had was specifically, and this seems like a good thing, specifically that minorities were not getting the type of education they could. Now, there's a racist side to that. There was a worry that people were ending up in gangs and generally lives of violence because of a failed educational system. So No Child Left Behind resonated with people as a policy, in part because people on both sides of the American political divide could see positive in it. People who were concerned about violence and crime thought of it as a policy that would help tackle what they saw as the source of crime, because they thought this was an inner city problem. Inner city is a word used to describe the places where minorities live. So they saw it as clearing up an inner city problem. Meanwhile, at least some people on the other side of the aisle, could also see it as potentially benefiting minorities with education. How could that be a bad thing? And it's not a bad thing. If you look at the frame that was sent out, the photograph of George W. Bush signing No Child Left Behind, it's not a coincidence that there are two healthy black children in the frame, no white children. That's not bad. I don't want to say he shouldn't have had those in there, but it leads you to wonder, well, what part did race play in these policies? And if we then look at consequence of the policies, so many school districts in big, largely democratic-leaning cities have faced takeover at a state level because the state says you're not teaching well enough. Yeah. So in Houston, you will find that the local people are not trusted to manage their own educational system, but rather Big Brother, the state, takes over.
Are you
How is
meaning to
that?
tie a parallel to the beginning of our discussion around tenure? Or is it just happening naturally?
It's happening naturally. These policies fit together. They resonate with each other. They're part of a nexus, a network of different overlapping ideas and ideals. Some connections are more thought out. Some seem more like analogies. But I don't think it's coincidence.
It reminds me of every time there's a session in Texas, there's a lawmaker that brings this policy or legislation where they should get to determine the laws in Austin.
Yeah.
You've heard of this. Like Austin shouldn't be able to dictate its own laws here. The legislature, the Texas legislature should do it.
Right.
That's an exact example of, hey, you can't govern yourselves. We should govern you.
And one way in which, let's say, the Austin Independent School District is different from the relevant Houston school districts is that is to do with the racial demographics of the city. And what you'll find is that places where there are state takeovers, just looking at numbers, but again, I don't claim neutrality in numbers.
Yeah, these numbers you're given tell a story that you want to tell.
So I'm telling a story with the numbers, but it's still numbers. The fact is that predominantly the places where there are takeovers are places with higher levels of minority populations. That's a fact, as I say. It's not a neutral fact.
It's not a neutral fact.
It supports a certain view that I have.
Yeah. And it's emotional.
It's emotional too. It's very disturbing because it feeds into a narrative of people not being trusted to look after themselves. And this has been used as a justification for example, slavery. It's claimed that enslaved people benefited from the institution of slavery because they were incapable of looking after their own interests. And this, I think most Americans, most people around the world would disagree with, but it's been put forward as a view in the past. So there's a resonance there between that type of argument, which I think we all have some awareness of, and the way that minority school districts and other bits of local government have a greater tendency to be taken over by often emergency management. So that's, of course, this is in the good old days when people still thought that there should be government at all. Maybe we're moving into a new phase where no one gets looked after, and it's just anarchy. Well, I hope not.
I hope not too. So we're talking about neutrality of data, neutrality of information, which is
Right.
probably impossible.
I don't think that neutrality makes much sense when you look closely, because everything that we choose to say, whether it's an actual fact or not, is something that we chose to say for a reason.
And everybody's on one side or the other.
We must have reasons and those reasons concern our interests. I don't know if it's necessarily a side, but whatever our interests are.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one problem.